All right, Vanessa, thanks so much for being here. My first question is, tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the journalism industry.
Hey, my name's Vanessa Maria Graber. I'm a journalist from Philadelphia. I work at the national media advocacy organization Free Press, and I'm the director of journalism and media education. And I also work locally here in Philly. I'm the co-owner and a reporter at the Philadelphia Hall Monitor, which is a worker-owned news cooperative that focuses on civic journalism. And I got my start in journalism in high school, actually. We had a TV station in our high school. It was called CDTV. And I used to read the morning news announcements. And then when I went to college, I majored in communications and I joined the campus radio station. And so that is where I began my career in media. I did some internships at radio stations, and then when I got hired, I continued to work in radio, and I've been doing journalism and media for more than 20 years.
That's a long time. So tell me a little bit about the work that you do currently.
So Free Press is a advocacy organization. We work on a number of different media and tech policy issues, including press freedom, regulating broadcast media through the FCC. We work on expanding access to broadband. We work on privacy and surveillance issues, combating disinformation. And we also have a Future of Journalism pillar, which is the team that I work on, where we work on expanding funding for local news through advocacy campaigns. And I work on creating resources, training, and education for journalists and newsrooms. And so I spend a lot of time connecting with journalists in local newsrooms across the country, doing presentations at journalism conferences. And right now I'm in the middle of doing a research project where I've been interviewing identify what makes them successful and what challenges they have. And in the next couple of months in Philadelphia, where I live, I'll be launching a journalism collaborative for Spanish language journalists and communicators.
That's nice. Now, this next question, I'm going to ask this a little bit differently. I'm going to ask for a name, and then you tell me if it means anything to you. Natalie Sukanagua.
Yes, Natalie is a friend of mine. I met her in Philadelphia when she was a student at Temple University, and we connected through NAHJ, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And then when she was a fellow or intern at WHYY, and we've stayed in contact ever since. And I am really excited about all of the great work that she's doing in journalism in New Jersey.
What has it been like working with her?
It's been great. I have taught at several universities, including Temple, Stockton University, University of North Carolina. And when I was the radio station manager at PhillyCam, we had a youth radio program and lots of interns. So I've always loved working with younger people, with students, and I believe in mentoring and supporting younger journalists. And so I'm really excited whenever I meet a younger person who has a lot of skills and talent and ability, like Natalie, who I hope to support, just like the many elders who supported me in my journey to do media.
hmm Now, this next question, I'm gonna ask this. What has been going on in terms of like the education aspect in terms of like, educating people about what's going on in the news media? Because Natalie and I talked about that, because oftentimes, in the news, people aren't as up to date as people would like themselves to be, or like the coverage on certain news stations is not as it's sort of as one-sided, or they have it as one perspective. So I'm curious to see what your take is on just sort of what's going on in that area.
Sure. Well, Free Press started in the early 2000s in response to growing media consolidation. And what essentially happened is that big corporations started buying up lots of independent media outlets. And that resulted in a lot of journalists getting laid off and losing their jobs, and a lot of the media being homogenous. What does that mean? Like it all sounds the same. Instead of having many different choices for local news, for example, we had less choice and we had less journalists and less diversity telling those stories. And when I worked in radio, for example, a lot of music stations had news departments. And when radio stations started to consolidate and become part of really big corporations and networks, we saw a really big loss of those news departments and just even local DJs and people working at these radio stations. And so, where we once had live, locally produced content, it moved to syndicated content or content that comes, out of a computer network. Stations were playing playlists instead of having DJs curate songs for them. At the same time, we also saw a decline in advertising revenue for newspapers because of the rise of the internet. So before, businesses would advertise in their local print newspaper. But then when Google and Facebook and other social media outlets emerged, a lot of those businesses then started to advertise on those platforms, which caused newspapers to lose a ton of money. And so we started to see lots of communities lose their local newspapers. And again, more journalists getting laid off. That trend continues today. So we have a real lack of local news infrastructure and also independently owned media outlets. And for that reason, a lot of people are turning to platforms like YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and X in order to get their news and information. Now, there's great content on all of those platforms. And as a journalist, I use those platforms also. However, there is also a lot of disinformation, a lot of fake news, if you will. And unfortunately, because we don't have a huge investment in schools and media and digital literacy programs, oftentimes a news consumer might not know the difference between something that's actually journalism that's been researched and, full of facts, um, and something that is disinformation. Now, there's also what we call content creators, people who sometimes will look at the news and interpret it for you. So oftentimes you'll see like a little talking head in front of a news headline, right? And they're explaining to you what it means. However, sometimes when people send me some of those videos, I will tell them, hey, actually, that person is citing a news source that's not legitimate. Like, that's not a real news outlet. There is what we call pink slime news, right? They're made to look like they're real news outlets, but really it's disinformation and propaganda. And sometimes content creators mistake that for news and will share that content. And if there's a content creator that you trust and you like what they're saying, and they present that to you, they might not be intentionally trying to mislead you. But nevertheless, they will proliferate the content to their millions of followers. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is news avoidance. There's been a really big shift to a focus on crime and doom and gloom, and a lot of racist and negative stereotypes about marginalized communities. And that results in people not wanting to read or view the news, right?
Mm-hmm.
It causes
Yeah.
anxiety. They don't feel they're represented accurately in the news headlines. And so, therefore, you'll hear people say, I don't really like the news. It depresses me. Or the news media is racist, or, it's controlled by a lot of newsrooms that are led by white men. Um, and so you can understand and sympathize with people who feel as though their communities are not represented accurately in the news, or they never see positive news stories or useful information. And so news avoidance is something that we study as well to try to understand what are the barriers for people in getting information. And then another thing that's related to all of that is the digital divide, right? Not everyone has access to the internet and smartphones. Um, a lot of sites are not accessible to people with visual and audio impairments. There is a lot of information that's not accessible in other languages. And so those digital divides can also be a barrier for people getting informed.
Mm-hmm. And what can be done to sift through all of that, through all the misinformation and through all of the sort of this idea of like I'm avoiding the news and all that kind of stuff. How do we sort of like sift through that? Because we are in some really complicated times. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always believe it's important to be informed, right? And to have information that's useful, that helps you navigate life and make good decisions. Now, for example, in Philadelphia, we're dealing with the Public Transit Authority making really big service cuts. And so, as a result, they canceled a lot of service lines are laying off people and, charging more money for fares. And they were waiting for the state legislature to fund the deficit, and that didn't happen. So when that deadline happened, they went into these cuts. But then there was a lawsuit that gave a preliminary injunction. And then I believe yesterday or the day before, there was another update to the lawsuit. My point is, if you're someone that relies on public transit, this is a news story that you had to follow because you literally didn't know how you were going to get to work or how your children were going to get to school or whether or not you were going to have to take a different route. And so this is an issue where people were finding it difficult to find accurate information because the story kept developing and there was new information all the time. And this is where I saw lots of people posting on social media, what's going on? What is the latest? How do I find out? Like, is my bus line canceled? And so this is a great example of like, there are times when you really do need information, right? And it is going to dictate how you move about in your day. And so at the Philadelphia Hall Monitor, we've been covering this story extensively and trying to give people the most up-to-date information. And so I think it's important for people to decide what issues are really important that they need to keep track of. And so, for people that ride public transit, you might want to keep tabs on things happening with public transit. If you have children that are in schools, you might want to know what's happening with decisions being made at the school board. If you're in a labor union, you might want to know what types of decisions are being made with your union. So everybody has issues that are important to them. And then you would want to find news providers that cover those issues. And I think this is where people need to crowdsource and ask for help. And so anytime I see somebody say, what are some good, reliable resources or news sources about X issue? Um, I will try to chime in and make recommendations. I also invite people to, ask me for suggestions because I'm happy to recommend some journalists that they can follow or some good local news sources. Like, for example, when Natalie first moved back to New Jersey and was looking to get involved in journalism, I told her, hey, did you know there's all of these new local news outlets that have emerged while you were away studying at school that didn't exist a few years ago that are now doing really great work in your community? And because she hadn't lived there in a few years, she wasn't aware of them. And so I made recommendations, hey, follow these people. And so I think it's a good idea to ask for recommendations from your friends and family and colleagues and say, hey, who are some journalists that you follow that you really trust? What are some good, reliable news sources. I think sometimes you can also follow your local municipalities, especially your offices of emergency management, the mayor's office. They tend to provide good information, as well as your state representatives and city council people. They usually give really good information about changes to legislation and resources. And there are also a ton of great content creators that will bring you the news stories and interpret them for you. Um, but I do think it's good to, on occasion, fact check them just to make sure that they are giving good information. And there are content creators who I have followed who have made mistakes, and I've DM'd them and had a conversation with them, and they were like, "Thank you so much." So it's good to, let them know if they are, spreading information that's not accurate. Um, and everyone has to decide for themselves how much news is too much. I start my morning with a 10-minute radio and TV show. It's called Democracy Now! And they have 10 minutes worth of headlines. And 10 minutes is plenty, right? Because
Hmm.
it's like pretty heavy. And it
Yeah.
oftentimes is very serious issues that are happening, not just in the US, but internationally. And I think 10 minutes for me is enough. Sometimes I want to listen to the whole show and it's 1 hour long. And so I do that. I know for my mom, she likes to come home from work and watch the 6 o'clock news on TV. And that's, half an hour, and that's her time to get caught up. Some older people, they still get the newspaper, right? And they like to get the newspaper and read that in the morning. So I think it all just depends. Some people like newsletters that give a weekly digest of the news. Maybe you're too busy to tune in every day, but maybe you want something that covers, everything happening, throughout the week. The good news is there's many different ways you can get news information. You can get it through text or WhatsApp. You can listen to podcasts like these. Um, you can listen to radio still while you're driving around. You can still buy newspapers. You can subscribe to different sites online. And so we do have a lot of different options despite the increasing media consolidation.
Hmm. Yeah, and honestly, subscribing to like news organizations is hard for me in this case because those paywalls. It's those annoying paywalls that you have to subscribe $3 and it's just I find that a struggle, but I guess that's how it is.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm a big believer in community radio. So the station that I started, WPPM, started it with a group of people, and we believed to make the information accessible and free, right? You don't need to have internet or an expensive device. You could simply tune in and listen. And I'm a big believer and supporter of public media. So if you're ever looking at a story, say, on a news site that's paywalled, almost every time you can find that same story from a different journalist through public media, so PBS or NPR. And there's also free information on sites like the Associated Press and Reuters. Um, and then there's also TV news, right? Those stories are so I think you can still find an alternative. um, and then there's other ways, right? Like sometimes you can ask a friend who might be able to give you a gift subscription. I know a friend of mine always does that when he'll send a story to the group chat and he'll say, "Hey, this is a subscription, so anybody can link to the story." I know at work sometimes I'm like, "Hey, does anybody have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal? I just want to look at this one article." And then somebody will have it and, download the article for me. So there are ways to kind of get around that. But one resource that is very underutilized is your local library. If you have a local library card, you can either go into the library and access many different newspapers, magazines, and publications, but you can also go online and get access to news content online through your library card.
Hmm. So, but then how do you my next question is how do you sort of teach how to report the news in a very sort of divided media atmosphere to like your students?
Yeah, well, one thing that I would teach when I was working at the universities and also when I train journalists is I try to find out what their values are, like why are motivated to do this work. Um, I know I'm motivated by a love of my community and wanting to empower my community and make sure their stories are being told. I think it all starts in your values, and your morals and ethics, and a sense of accountability to the people that you're serving. When we feel like we're unaccountable and we can do whatever we want, sometimes that results in journalism that can be really harmful. And I know that I have interviewed guests that maybe were divisive, and people said, "Hey, why did you have that person on your show?" And that feedback was automatic, which is good because then you have to explain yourself and be accountable, right? And so I always think it's good when people are giving you feedback about your work and wanting to have a conversation about it. And the fact that, many journalists are open to that shows that they're willing to be accountable to their communities. I think the other part of it is teaching people the history of harm, right? Like we don't learn that in journalism schools ever. We're not taught that media has harmed indigenous people. Like the first newspaper articles in the United States were very racist, horrible depictions about indigenous people, right? So like the first opportunity we had to make the news in the US was used to harm this entire group of people and further colonization and genocide. And so we're not taught to study the history of newspapers and media and how they've been used to harm communities of color, LGBT people, disabled communities, and others. And so at Free Press, we have a project called Media 2070, and there is an essay that people can read which details this history of harm, in particular against Black people. And it gives many examples of that. I think in order to repair harm, we need to first acknowledge the truth and the history of what people experience. Only then can we begin to start repairing those relationships. And so when we start telling journalists, hey, did you know that this paper that you worked at used to do all of these things, right? Like, if you're wondering why it's hard for you to engage with communities, well, they've experienced a lot of harmful content, right? And so now you're coming along. You might be a great journalist, but you are carrying the legacy of harm with you when you're going into these communities and trying to interview people. So we have to make people aware of the harm and also how to not be harmful in the future, right? By educating
Hmm.
people around the way that photographs and headlines and inaccurate depictions of communities and the language that we use can be harmful. And so there are many practitioners like me who do this work where we try to, again, educate people about how to do better journalism, more ethical journalism, um, that helps the community and not harms them.
Hmm. And what was your, favorite part about doing this kind of work? Because I remember when I started in the journalism industry, I really liked writing. I had a knack for writing. I had a passion for it, and that's what Natalie and I shared. We both like to write, because oftentimes people that are outside journalism are like, "Oh, you're in journalism? Oh, okay, that's great. How are you gonna make money off of it?" Like so all these doubters from the outside, right?
Well, we certainly don't do it for the money. Like I said, I do it because I love telling people stories, and I love when my stories have an impact. Um, and I remember early on when I was still a college student, I worked for a radio station in Western Pennsylvania in the middle of nowhere called WDAD. And I used to go to the city council and school board meetings. And at one of the city, I think it was called Board of Supervisors actually, in Borough Township, a group of people, residents came complaining about the coal plant polluting the air, polluting their homes, and the trucks being very loud and driving recklessly. And I remember that the board of supervisors like wouldn't let them speak and dismissed their claims. And these folks were so frustrated and upset, with not getting the opportunity to be heard. And I took the time to find out who they were, what their story was, and understand the impact of this coal plant and what it had on their health and their quality of life. And I did my story on those people. The other journalists in the room did their story about how much salt the township was buying that year for the winter. And so my story aired the next day, and it got so much traction and popularity that the competing station copied that story. They stole my sound bites. I was so mad about it. And the very next day after that, the Indiana Gazette decided to cover the story and put it on their front page. But initially, we all went to the same meeting, and they did not feature those people or amplify their stories. And what subsequently happened is that the EPA did an investigation and went out there to test the soil and the water. And that is what the people were seeking. And so that happened early on in my career, and I was really inspired by that. Like, wow, I just did this one little story, and look what happened, right? This actually helped people. And I have a lot of stories like that, where we covered it. I worked with a team to cover it, or a station covered it, and it resulted in some kind of positive outcome or change happening. And there are so many times, especially when I was the radio station manager at the community radio station, where people had said for the first time they had been interviewed. Countless people were, this is my first time on the radio. This is my first time doing an interview. And it made me realize again how many people are excluded from the media, how many groups of people are underrepresented. And the opportunity to give those folks a platform to speak their truth, tell their story, give a different perspective, was truly a privilege. And so I am always inspired by the people that I talk to and the stories that they're willing to tell. And it is never a boring day in this business,
Hmm.
especially this year. But I really do love my job. I love operating a local newsroom and getting to cover issues that are of importance to my community. And I love helping other emerging newsrooms and journalists be able to do the same thing.
Hmm. And what tips and advice would you give to those who are wanting to enter in the journalism industry that are curious about what it's like, that kind of thing?
Yeah, just start making content. I think that that is like the first step. Start writing. There are plenty of events that you can go out there and quote unquote cover. You can go to a cultural or arts event. You can go to a protest. You can go to a city council meeting. And you can start by doing those public things. I think if you don't have a job lined up or an internship, you can start a Substack, right? You can start a newsletter. You can also start a YouTube channel or a TikTok. Um, but I think the biggest barrier for people is just getting started. A lot of the first stories that I wrote were terrible. I mean, I would probably be really embarrassed to have them air nowadays. But everyone has to start somewhere. And I
Yeah.
think the best thing to do is if you are doing any type of video or audio content, is to listen and watch yourself. That's how you can improve, right? If you're making mistakes. And if you're writing, you want to have friends or colleagues be able to read it and give you feedback. There are traditional ways where you can learn journalism by going to the university. But also, you can go to your local public access or community media center. There's lots of free or low cost classes there. And there's a lot of fellowships for citizen or community reporters. And there's a lot of free online content, like on the Pointer Institute, for example. There's tons of online courses and modules that you can take for free to learn how to write and be a better journalist. And then if you're able to, like many of us, we went out on internship and we worked at a news organization and were able to get some experience. I have a lot of friends who do freelance work, which is another avenue. And you can start with smaller publications that have not a lot of staff. They're more willing to take on an experienced journalist because, they need the help and they're willing
Mhm.
to work with them.
Yeah. All righty.